extremely rude
Yes,
young
I
man
am. This is
disrespects the king's
perfect.
guard.
Look at
The
the
air was
horse. He is
filled with the
so
sounds of
still.
chatter, the clinking of coins, and the occasional horse-drawn carriage passing by. The town was peaceful, a typical day for most people who lived there, but for one young man, it was the perfect moment to make a statement. He wasn't the type to blend in with the crowd. His arrogance was as noticeable as the bright red coat he wore. He strutted down the cobbled path, his boots clicking sharply against the stones with every step. His eyes were full of self-confidence, as if he owned not just the street but the whole town. People noticed him, of course, and most moved aside to let him pass, though some couldn't help but glance at him with curiosity or disdain. The young man had a reputation in the town. He was known for his sharp tongue and even sharper temper. He didn't respect anyone, especially not authority. He considered himself above the rules, and his attitude reflected that. The townsfolk whispered about him in quiet corners. Some said he was simply young and foolish. Others believed he would come to regret his reckless behavior sooner or later. But today, the young man felt particularly untouchable. As he walked, he glanced around with a smug smile on his face, taking in the scene before him. His eyes landed on something, or rather someone, that caught his attention. Standing at the edge of the square, near the entrance to the castle, was a member of the king's guard. The King's Guard was a group of elite soldiers who protected the royal family and their interests. They were known for their strict discipline and loyalty, and their armor always gleamed in the sunlight, a sign of their dedication. The guard in question stood tall, his posture rigid and unmoving. He was a man of few words, his face hidden behind a silver helmet, but there was an undeniable strength in his presence. People respected him, even feared him. He was a reminder that the king's reach extended far beyond the castle walls, that no one was truly above the law. But to the young man, the guard was just another figure of authority to challenge, just another opportunity to show off his defiance. Without hesitation, the young man began to approach. His steps quickened as he drew closer, his eyes fixed on the guard like a predator stalking its prey. There was no mistaking what he intended to do. This would be his moment to prove that no one, not even the king's soldiers, could intimidate him. As he reached the guard, he slowed his pace. The guard stood motionless, as he had been trained to do, not reacting to the young man's approach. The young man, however, didn't plan on letting that slide. He came to a halt in front of the soldier and stared up at him. The guard's silence only seemed to encourage the young man further. His lips curled into a smirk, and he took a deep breath. "Do you ever get bored standing there all day?" he asked, his voice loud enough for the people around them to hear. "Just standing around like a statue, waiting for something to happen. How does it feel to be so useless?" The words were pointed, designed to provoke. The young man's eyes sparkled with the thrill of insulting someone so respected, someone so clearly unbothered. He took pleasure in seeing how the guard would react. Would he break his stoic appearance? Would he lose his temper? But the guard, as expected, didn't flinch. He simply stood there, his hands resting calmly on the hilt of his sword. The young man waited, expecting a reaction, any kind of reaction. He had been used to people responding to his taunts, whether with anger, embarrassment, or frustration. But this time there was nothing, just silence. It was as if the guard didn't even hear him. Annoyed, the young man's gaze narrowed. This wasn't how he had imagined it going. He had expected the guard to snap, to respond to the insult in some way, but instead, the soldier's calmness seemed to mock him. He couldn't stand it. The young man needed to get a rise out of him to prove that even the strongest among them could be shaken. "Are you deaf or just dumb?" The young man shot back, his voice rising slightly. "I'm speaking to you. You know, I bet you're just another puppet for the king. Standing there like a loyal dog waiting for your next command. Is that really all you're good for?" Still, no reaction. The people in the square had begun to notice the exchange. Some were watching in curiosity, while others seemed uncomfortable, as though they knew something was about to break. It wasn't often that anyone dared speak so openly to the king's guard, especially with such disrespect. But the young man was pushing his luck, clearly enjoying the spectacle he was causing. The guard's lack of response only made the young man bolder. He stepped closer, his face now only inches from the soldier's helmet. "You're just a fool," he spat, his voice dripping with disdain. "No one even cares about you. You think you're important, standing there with your shiny armor, but you're nothing." The guard's eyes remained steady behind his visor, and for a moment it seemed as though the tension between them might snap. The young man was almost daring the guard to respond. He wanted to see if the soldier would finally lose his cool, if he would break the strict code of discipline that defined him. But still, the guard didn't react. He didn't even seem to acknowledge the insults. His face remained stoic, and his body stood perfectly still, like a mountain that refused to be moved. Frustration bubbled inside the young man. He was used to making people react, used to getting a rise out of anyone who crossed his path. He had spent his life testing boundaries, pushing limits, and flaunting his power. But the guard, this man, seemed immune to his taunts, and that more than anything made the young man feel small. Just as he was about to say something more cutting, something else caught his attention, a flicker of movement in the corner of his eye. It was subtle, but it was enough to remind him that there were eyes watching. He had crossed a line, and the moment of tension between him and the guard was far from over. As the crowd around them grew, so did the pressure. The young man's playful mockery had shifted into something more dangerous. He had poked the bear too many times, and now the consequences of his actions were beginning to unfold. But the young man didn't notice. He was too focused on the quiet soldier in front of him, and for the first time he felt a strange feeling creeping up in his chest, a feeling he didn't recognize. The young man's taunts hung in the air, but the king's guard remained as unmoving as a statue. The crowd around them had grown, and whispers of curiosity rippled through the gathering. People weren't used to seeing a member of the king's guard confronted so boldly, especially not in such a public manner. It was as though a small ripple had started in the square, and everyone was holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The young man, however, seemed oblivious to the growing tension. His words had started as insults, but now they were more like a challenge. He wasn't just trying to get a rise out of the guard, he was trying to break him. He wanted to prove that no one, not even the king's elite soldiers, could stand above him. He had been the center of attention all his life, always admired or feared, never ignored. The guard's complete lack of response had ignited something inside him, a need to push further, to test the limits of power and authority. At this point, the young man took another step closer to the guard. His boots clicked loudly on the cobblestones, echoing in the now silent square. The guard's eyes remained fixed ahead, his posture as rigid and disciplined as before. But this time, the young man didn't stop. He stepped right in front of the guard, blocking his path, and tilted his head to meet the guard's visor, which hid the soldier's eyes. "Do you even know what real power is?" the young man asked, his voice dripping with arrogance. "You stand there like you're someone important, but you're just a tool for the king, nothing more." He waited for a response, for something, anything, that would show the guard's humanity. The soldier's silence was almost maddening. The young man had seen people break before, had seen others crumble under pressure or at least flinch. But the guard didn't flinch. The soldier didn't even blink. It was as if the young man's words were nothing but the wind, blowing through without leaving a mark. This frustrated the young man even more. He had heard rumors about the king's guard. They were known for their strict codes, their loyalty, and their discipline. But the young man had never truly understood what that meant until now. He didn't know if it was a personal challenge or just sheer curiosity, but the longer the guard remained silent, the more determined the young man became to break that silence. The young man's insults grew more personal. He started to comment on the guard's appearance, calling his armor too shiny, too stiff. He mocked the way the soldier stood, as though he couldn't move even if he wanted to. It was a game now, a dangerous game. The young man was trying to find a crack, a weak point in the guard's unshakable resolve. But the more the young man spoke, the less it seemed to affect the guard. There was no sign of emotion behind the visor, no hint of a flinch, no sign that the words were even reaching him. It was as if the guard had become an unfeeling machine. The young man's mind raced. How could this be happening? Why wasn't the guard responding? Do you even have a name? The young man sneered, hoping to break through. Or are you just another faceless soldier who follows orders without thinking? Still, there was no response. The guard didn't move, didn't even turn his head. It was maddening. The young man's face reddened with frustration. It wasn't just the soldier's refusal to react. It was the way he was holding his ground with such grace and control. The young man was used to people reacting to him, used to seeing others bend to his will, whether through fear, admiration, or even the power of his words. But the guard was different. With every moment that passed, the young man's insults grew more pointed, more aggressive. He called the guard a coward, a puppet, and even went so far as to mock the entire idea of the king's guard. But the soldier, despite the insults, never budged. The young man couldn't understand it. It was as though the soldier's entire being was wrapped up in something more powerful than anything he could throw at him, something he couldn't touch. By now, the crowd had grown even larger. People had stopped what they were doing and gathered in a loose circle, watching the exchange unfold. Some of them seemed uncomfortable, unsure of what to make of it. Others were more curious, wondering just how far the young man would go and what would happen next. The tension in the air had reached its peak, and the square felt as though it was holding its breath, waiting for a spark to ignite. But still, the guard remained unyielding. The young man's frustration boiled over. This wasn't how he had imagined this encounter would go. He thought for sure that the guard would snap, that he would respond with anger or force, but nothing. The soldier's silence was like a wall, and it infuriated him even more. He took a step back, trying to collect himself. His mind raced as he tried to come up with something that would break the guard's composure. He paced back and forth in front of the soldier, throwing his arms up in the air as if to show how pointless the whole situation was. He muttered insults under his breath, hoping that maybe, just maybe, the guard would react. But there was no reaction. The young man's steps became erratic as he began to circle the guard, trying to provoke him in any way he could. The soldier's helmet didn't even follow him, didn't shift an inch. The young man's voice grew louder and his words more cutting, but still, the guard was silent. He might as well have been a stone statue for all the good his words were doing. The young man's face turned bright red as his temper flared. This wasn't just about insulting the guard anymore. It was about winning. It was about making the guard react, proving that he could make anyone bend to his will. He had to make the soldier feel something, anything. It was then that a voice from the crowd called out, "Enough, boy." The voice was calm but firm, cutting through the young man's insults like a knife. It wasn't loud, but it was commanding, and everyone in the square turned to see who had spoken. The young man froze for a moment, the sting of the words hitting him harder than he expected. It was the town commander, a man known for his sharp wit and his no-nonsense attitude. "Take your games elsewhere," the commander said, his eyes locking with the young man's. "You're making a fool of yourself." The young man stared at the commander for a moment, realizing that this was not just an ordinary encounter anymore. The situation had shifted, and it was now about more than just him and the guard. The commander's words hung in the air, and the young man, feeling the weight of them, stopped pacing. But before he could respond, the commander's gaze shifted to the guard. The soldier's stillness remained unbroken, and for the first time, the young man noticed a small glint in the guard's eye, a quiet, powerful reminder that the guard's silence wasn't weakness. It was strength. The young man stood there, his mouth slightly open, as the reality of the situation began to sink in. The guard had won, not through force, but through control. And in that moment, the young man realized something that would stay with him forever. True power wasn't about making noise or drawing attention to oneself. It was about standing firm, no matter what. The crowd's murmurs grew louder after the commander's intervention. The young man stood still for a moment, caught off guard by the sudden shift in the atmosphere. The commander's sharp gaze, combined with the steady, unwavering presence of the king's guard, had an unexpected effect. For the first time, the young man felt unsure of himself. His usual confidence faltered. He had been so focused on breaking the guard, on making him react, that he hadn't noticed how the situation had shifted. What had started as a playful challenge had escalated into something bigger than he had ever imagined. Now, with the commander's words hanging in the air, the young man felt a strange tension in his chest, a feeling he wasn't used to. The commander's voice had carried authority, and the way he looked at the young man made it clear that there were lines that should not be crossed. The crowd around them seemed to sense the change too. Some of them shifted uneasily, as if they were no longer sure which side to take. Had the young man gone too far? Was the guard's silence not a sign of weakness but a sign of something more powerful? The young man, now standing face to face with the commander, felt the weight of the eyes on him. He tried to hold his ground, but something inside him wavered. He had been in many situations where he felt untouchable. His words, his presence, his position had always given him power over others. But now, standing in front of this soldier and the commander, he was beginning to realize that some battles weren't won through words. Some battles were won through restraint, through the simple act of standing firm. The young man clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms as he struggled to regain his composure. He had never backed down from a challenge, never let anyone see his vulnerability. But now, in front of the king's guard, he felt as though he had been exposed, his arrogance and bravado fading away like a mask slipping off. He glanced quickly at the guard again, still standing motionless, his face hidden behind the helmet. The soldier's unwavering silence was now starting to feel like a lesson. The young man had spent his life believing that power came from being loud, from drawing attention to himself, from forcing people to listen. But the guard's stillness, his calmness, his ability to stand unmoved spoke volumes. It was a power the young man didn't understand, one that couldn't be won by shouting or mocking. For the first time, the young man questioned his own approach to life. He had never thought much about respect, not real respect. He had always believed that respect was something given to those who demanded it, who commanded it with force and bravado. But now, as he looked at the guard, he realized that respect could also be earned through patience, through quiet strength, and through the ability to remain calm in the face of provocation. The silence between them was broken when the commander spoke again. This time his tone was softer but still firm. "This isn't the place for your games," he said, his voice low enough for only the young man to hear. "You may be young, but you've learned nothing about what it means to be a man." The words stung. The young man's face flushed, but he couldn't deny the truth behind them. He had acted impulsively, letting his emotions control him. He had let his pride and need for attention drive him to disrespect someone who had earned his place through years of service and discipline. It was a humbling realization. "I wasn't trying to disrespect anyone," the young man muttered, though his voice lacked the certainty it once had. "I was just having a little fun." The commander's eyes locked with his, a hint of disappointment in them. "Fun," he repeated, his voice steady. "Is that what you think this is? Fun?" The young man swallowed, the weight of the question settling in. What had he been thinking? His actions had been reckless, immature, and thoughtless. The guard had simply stood there, not because he didn't care, but because he understood that there was more to strength than provocation, more to respect than mockery. The commander didn't give the young man a chance to explain himself further. Instead, he turned his gaze to the guard. "You've learned something today," the commander said, his voice now carrying a hint of approval. "Perhaps next time you'll think before you speak." The young man's heart raced as he processed the words. What had he learned? What did he truly understand now that he hadn't before? The answers were elusive, and yet they seemed to be right in front of him. For the first time, he realized that his actions had consequences. That there were people who weren't swayed by empty words, who weren't impressed by his arrogance. That some people were beyond being provoked, beyond being manipulated. And the guard standing before him was one of those people. The young man could feel the difference now, could see the strength in the soldier's composure. The guard had power, not through force, but through the quiet certainty that he did not need to respond to every challenge thrown his way. The young man's gaze fell to the ground as he took a step back. He felt foolish, but not in the way he usually did when someone bested him in an argument. This time, the realization was deeper, more humbling. It wasn't about winning or losing. It was about understanding the power of restraint, the power of silence, and the power of respect. And in that moment, the young man understood that there was more to being a man than simply talking louder than everyone else. As the crowd began to disperse, some quietly admiring the guard's strength and composure, the young man remained where he stood, deep in thought. The commander had been right. He had learned something today, something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. The king's guard, still standing at attention, was now a symbol of something the young man had never truly understood. True strength didn't need to shout to be heard. It didn't need to belittle others to be powerful. It simply needed to be. The young man's arrogance, once a shield he used to protect himself, now seemed like nothing more than a mask. And for the first time, he wondered if it was time to take it off. The young man stood there, his mind racing, as the crowd around him slowly began to disperse. They had witnessed the confrontation, and now, most were quietly going about their business, the excitement of the moment fading with each passing second. But for the young man, everything felt different. His thoughts were tangled, unsure of what to make of the strange feeling growing inside him. The commander's words echoed in his mind. "You've learned something today. Perhaps next time you'll think before you speak." It wasn't just the commander's disapproval that lingered in his thoughts. It was the way the king's guard had stood so still, so composed. The soldier hadn't shouted, hadn't reacted to the insults, and yet he had held power in his silence. There was something powerful about that kind of strength, something the young man had never truly understood until now. He looked over at the guard again. The soldier was still standing tall, just as he had been before, his posture unyielding. The helmet hid the guard's face, but the young man could feel the presence of someone who had lived a life of discipline, who had mastered the art of restraint. It was a quiet kind of power, and for the first time, the young man felt a deep respect for it. But that respect didn't come easily. It wasn't something he could just brush aside. The young man was used to being the one in control, used to commanding attention, used to being the center of everything. He had grown up believing that power was in the noise, in the spectacle, in the ability to bend others to your will. But here now, with the king's guard standing silently before him, he was starting to understand that real power didn't always need to be loud. It didn't always need to demand attention. The young man took a slow breath and walked away from the guard, his steps heavier than usual. He couldn't shake the feeling of having lost something, but at the same time, he couldn't deny that something within him was changing. Maybe the guard hadn't lost the battle, but the young man had certainly lost his certainty. The arrogance that had always come so easily to him now felt foreign, as if he were wearing someone else's skin. As he made his way through the square, the young man's thoughts continued to swirl. He had always seen himself as someone special, someone who could easily push the boundaries, who could get away with whatever he wanted. But today, for the first time, he had encountered something that made him feel small, something that made him question his entire way of thinking. It was humbling, to say the least. And then, as if the universe had decided to add weight to his thoughts, a familiar voice called out his name. He turned to see a figure approaching, a woman he knew well, though their relationship had never been more than acquaintances. She was tall, her hair dark and neatly tied back, and there was a look of concern on her face as she stepped toward him. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her eyes scanning his face. "I thought you'd left the square by now." The young man tried to offer a smile, but it felt forced. "I was just thinking." "Thinking?" she repeated, raising an eyebrow. "You don't usually think, you act." He couldn't help but chuckle at that. She wasn't wrong. He had always been impulsive, following his emotions rather than stopping to reflect on the consequences. But now, after the encounter with the guard and the commander, his mind was spinning with new ideas, new realizations. He had spent so much time trying to impress others, trying to maintain an image of power, that he had never taken a moment to understand what real strength looked like. The woman noticed the change in his demeanor, the way he wasn't standing as tall or as confidently as he usually did. She had always seen him as someone who thrived on attention, someone who craved validation. But now there was something different about him, something quieter, more reflective. She studied him carefully as if she were trying to figure out what had happened. "Something happened, didn't it?" she asked, her voice softer now. "You're not the same as you were before." The young man didn't answer right away. He could feel the weight of her words, the way they seemed to mirror his own feelings. Something had shifted. Something had clicked into place during the confrontation, and it wasn't something he could easily explain. All he knew was that the arrogant bravado he had carried with him for so long didn't feel as important anymore. "I don't know what came over me," he said slowly. "I thought I could just push him, get a reaction, but he didn't react the way I thought he would. He didn't give me what I wanted." The woman nodded as though she understood. "People like him don't need to react to your insults. They don't need to give you the satisfaction of a response. They're not playing your game. They've already won." The young man thought about her words. They were true. The guard had not only stood silent in the face of insults, but by doing so, he had taken control of the situation. His refusal to be provoked, his ability to stay composed, was a strength that the young man had never appreciated until now. It wasn't about silencing others. It was about having the strength to remain calm, to remain unshaken no matter what was thrown at you. "I think I've been doing it all wrong," he said quietly. "I've been looking for power in all the wrong places. I thought if I made enough noise, if I had enough people watching, that would be power. But now I see there's power in silence, in standing still, in not letting others control you." The woman gave him a small, knowing smile. "It's not something that happens overnight, but you're on the right path." The young man felt a sense of gratitude toward her, though he couldn't quite put the feeling into words. He had been so sure of himself, so convinced that he had all the answers, that he hadn't seen the bigger picture. But now, with the woman's encouragement, he could see a new way forward, one where power didn't come from how loud you could be, but from how steady and strong you could remain in the face of challenge. As they stood there together, the young man felt a shift in his heart. He had a long way to go, but he knew that this moment had marked the beginning of a change. He didn't know where this new path would lead, but for the first time he felt a sense of peace about it. "Thank you," he said, his voice sincere. "I think I needed to hear that." The woman's smile widened, and with a nod she turned to leave. "You're welcome. Take care of yourself." The young man watched her walk away, feeling a sense of clarity he had never known before. He wasn't the same person who had walked into the square earlier that day. He was starting to see the world and himself in a different light. And as he turned to look back at the king's guard, still standing quietly where he had left him, he knew that he would never forget the lesson he had learned today. That true strength doesn't come from how loud you shout, but from how still you can remain when everything around you is calling for a response. The young man walked through the square, his footsteps slower now, more thoughtful. The crowd had scattered and the usual bustle of the town had returned, but everything felt different. The world around him hadn't changed, but he had. As he looked around, his eyes no longer searched for admiration or attention. He wasn't looking for the reactions he had once craved. Instead, he was noticing the little things, the way the sunlight filtered through the trees, the soft hum of the town in the background, the quiet hum of life that continued whether he was paying attention to it or not. He had always been so focused on making himself seen, on proving his worth through loud gestures and sharp words. But now, something inside him was shifting. The need to stand out, to demand respect from others, was slowly fading away. He was beginning to understand that true respect wasn't something you could force. It wasn't something you could earn with insults or challenges. It was something that came with patience, understanding, and the ability to stand firm in your beliefs without having to shout them to the world. The words of the commander still echoed in his mind. "You've learned something today." He had. But the lesson wasn't just about how to treat others. It was about how to treat himself. He had spent so many years putting on a mask, pretending to be someone he wasn't, someone who thrived on attention and admiration. But now he was beginning to see that there was more to life than playing the game of pride and ego. He didn't need to be the loudest person in the room to be important. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone. He simply needed to be himself. As he walked through the town, he found himself passing by familiar places. The market stalls where he had once bargained for the best prices, the fountain where children often played, the tavern where he had spent countless evenings with his friends, showing off and laughing too loudly. But now, as he passed each place, he felt a sense of detachment. These were places he had frequented, but they no longer held the same significance. It wasn't that he didn't care about them. It was that he no longer needed them to define who he was. His thoughts turned back to the king's guard. He hadn't forgotten the lesson he had learned from the soldier's silence. The guard had been a symbol of something the young man had never truly understood: strength in restraint. The guard had shown him that power didn't need to be flaunted. It didn't need to be demanded. It just had to be. The guard's calmness in the face of provocation, his ability to stand without reacting, had opened the young man's eyes to a kind of strength he had never before considered. What had been a challenge in the beginning had now become a revelation. The young man had seen the guard as a symbol of authority, someone who was part of the king's forces, someone who could easily overpower him. But in the end, it wasn't about power at all. It was about control. The guard had control over his emotions, his actions, and his responses. And that kind of control was the truest form of power. The young man didn't know if he would ever be as composed as the guard, but he knew now that it wasn't about matching someone else's strength. It was about finding his own. It was about learning to stay calm, to think before reacting, to understand that some situations required silence, not words. He stopped walking for a moment and leaned against the side of a building, his thoughts swirling. The world was noisy, full of distractions, full of people who sought attention, who chased after fame and power. But in that moment, as he stood there, he realized something. None of it mattered. Not the opinions of others, not the accolades, not the need to prove himself. What mattered was being true to himself, being honest with who he was, and letting that quiet strength shine through. That was the kind of power he now wanted to have. His eyes fell on the horizon as the sun began to set. The sky was painted with shades of orange, pink, and purple. It was beautiful, simple, and peaceful. The young man thought about how, just hours ago, He had been caught up in the noise of the square, trying to make himself heard. But now, in this moment of quiet reflection, he understood something deeper about life. True beauty, true peace, came from within. And it wasn't about the loud moments or the grand gestures. It was in the stillness, in the quiet understanding, and in the moments when you chose to rise above the noise. His heart felt lighter as he stood there, watching the sunset. The weight of his past arrogance, his need to constantly assert himself, seemed to slip away. He had carried it with him for so long, not even realizing how heavy it was. But now it was gone. The young man wasn't sure exactly how it had happened, but he knew that today had marked a turning point in his life. He turned back toward the square, a sense of calm settling over him. The guard was still there, standing as he had before. But now, the young man no longer saw him as just a soldier. He saw him as a teacher. The guard had taught him more than he had ever imagined. And while the young man would never forget the words the guard had never said, he also knew that it was time for him to move forward. It was time for him to take what he had learned and begin the process of change. As he walked back through the square, he saw the familiar faces of the townsfolk who had witnessed the confrontation earlier. Some of them nodded in his direction, and others gave him curious glances. He didn't feel the need to prove anything to them anymore. He didn't need to make a grand gesture or say anything to them. He simply walked past them, his head held high, not with arrogance but with quiet confidence. The young man understood now that power came from within, from mastering yourself, from controlling your own actions and reactions. It wasn't about dominating others or making them bend to your will. It was about standing firm, knowing who you were, and letting your actions speak for themselves. The young man didn't need to shout anymore. He didn't need to demand respect. He had earned it in a way that was far more lasting and meaningful. And so, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the young man walked on, ready to face whatever came next, not with prideful arrogance, but with the quiet strength of someone who had learned the value of restraint, respect, and inner peace.